In 1984, while most of the world was just beginning to understand personal computers, a Japanese professor had a vision that seemed impossible: one operating system to run them all. Not just computers, but every electronic device humanity would ever create. Refrigerators, cars, cameras, industrial robots, supercomputers, all speaking the same digital language, all running the same elegant code. This wasn't science fiction. It was a meticulously planned national project backed by Japan's most powerful corporations and brightest minds. The project was called TRON, and for a brief moment in history, it looked like it might actually succeed. The man behind this audacious vision was Ken Sakamura, a professor at the University of Tokyo. In his early 30s, Sakamura had already earned a reputation as one of Japan's most innovative computer scientists. But he wasn't interested in building just another operating system to compete with the nascent Microsoft or the established Unix. Sakamura saw something bigger: the coming age of ubiquitous computing, where processors would be embedded in everything around us. He called it TRON, the real-time operating system nucleus. It was open source before open source was a movement, and royalty-free in an era when software licensing was becoming big business. To understand why TRON mattered, you need to understand Japan in the 1980s. The country was experiencing what seemed like an unstoppable economic ascent. Japanese cars had conquered American roads. Japanese electronics filled American homes. Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, Hitachi, these names represented the future. Japan's GDP was growing at rates that made Western economists nervous. There was serious talk in Washington and London that Japan might actually overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. The Japanese model, close cooperation between government and industry, long-term planning, heavy investment in research, appeared to be winning. But there was one sector where Japan lagged behind: software. Japanese companies built excellent hardware, the chips, the circuit boards, the physical machines. But the software that made those machines useful largely came from America. IBM dominated business computing. Microsoft was beginning its rise with MS-DOS. Unix variants controlled universities and research labs. Japanese engineers were world-class, but they were programming in English-based languages, running American operating systems, following American standards. For a nation that prided itself on technological independence, this was an uncomfortable dependency. TRON was meant to change that. Sakamura's design was revolutionary in its scope. TRON wasn't one operating system, it was a family of 4. TRON for industrial equipment and embedded systems. TRON for business and personal computers. TRON for telecommunications. And TRON for real-time control and machinery. Each was optimized for its domain, but all shared common design principles and could communicate seamlessly. The vision was total interoperability: your car could talk to your home, your watch to your refrigerator, your calculator to the city's traffic systems. This was the Internet of Things, imagined decades before the term existed. What made TRON truly radical was its business model, or lack of one. Sakamura insisted that TRON be open and royalty-free. Anyone could use it, modify it, build products around it, without paying licensing fees. In an industry increasingly dominated by proprietary standards and jealously guarded intellectual property, this was almost unthinkable. But Sakamura understood something profound: if TRON became the universal standard, Japan would control the foundation of the digital age, even if it didn't collect a single yen in license fees. The value wasn't in selling the software, it was in defining how the future would work. The Japanese government recognized TRON's strategic importance immediately. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry (MITI), the powerful agency that had orchestrated Japan's industrial policy for decades, threw its weight behind the project. So did the Ministry of Education. In 1987, MITI announced that TRON would become the standard operating system for Japanese schools. Millions of students would learn computing on TRON-based machines. An entire generation would grow up fluent in Sakamura's ecosystem. Major corporations Fujitsu, NEC, Hitachi, Matsushita joined the TRON Association and began developing products. The momentum seemed unstoppable. By the late 1980s, TRON was making real progress. iTRON, the embedded systems variant, was particularly successful. Japanese manufacturers began embedding it in cameras, printers, fax machines, and industrial equipment. It was lightweight, efficient, and reliable, perfect for devices with limited memory and processing power. Within a few years, iTRON would become one of the most widely used operating systems in the world, invisible to consumers but running quietly inside millions of devices. The other variants were progressing too. Prototype TRON computers were being built. The vision of universal computing was becoming tangible, moving from academic papers to actual products. In Washington, people were starting to pay attention, and they didn't like what they saw. The United States was already locked in an increasingly bitter trade dispute with Japan. The trade deficit with Japan had ballooned to unprecedented levels. American manufacturers complained that Japanese markets were closed to foreign competition while Japanese products flooded America. Politicians faced pressure from constituents who watched factories close and jobs disappear. The mood was turning protectionist. Books with titles like The Japan That Can Say No and warnings about Japan buying up American assets fed a growing anxiety. And now Japan was moving to dominate software too? The US-Japan trade war of the 1980s was fought on multiple fronts: automobiles, semiconductors, rice, telecommunications equipment. Each industry became a political battleground. The Reagan administration, despite its free market rhetoric, was pressuring Japan to accept voluntary export restraints, open its markets, and limit its competitive advantages. The Semiconductor Agreement of 1986 had already forced Japan to accept price floors and market share guarantees for American chips in Japan. American trade negotiators were aggressive, wielding the threat of tariffs and trade sanctions. They were looking for leverage wherever they could find it. And TRON was about to give them another pressure point. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. Buried in its provisions was Section 301, expanded and strengthened Super 301, as it became known. This gave the United States Trade Representative sweeping authority to identify and retaliate against unfair foreign trade practices. Countries could be designated as priority foreign countries. Specific practices could be targeted. And if negotiations failed, the U.S. could impose tariffs and sanctions unilaterally. It was a powerful weapon, and Japan was the obvious target. The question wasn't whether Super 301 would be used against Japan, it was what targets would be selected. American computer companies saw TRON as a threat. If Japanese schools standardized on TRON, if Japanese manufacturers built the next generation of devices around it, American software companies would be locked out of a massive market. Microsoft, still years away from Windows dominance but ambitious and politically connected, lobbied hard. So did other American tech firms. They argued that Japan's government backing of TRON constituted an unfair trade practice, a non-tariff barrier that would exclude American operating systems from Japanese markets. The fact that TRON was technically open source and royalty-free didn't matter. What mattered was that Japan's government was picking winners, and American companies would lose. Carla Hills became U.S. Trade Representative in 1989, and she brought a tough, aggressive approach to Japan negotiations. She had a mandate from the Bush administration to reduce the trade deficit and open Japanese markets. Hills became known for her hard-nosed tactics, her willingness to threaten sanctions, her impatience with what she saw as Japanese foot-dragging and market protectionism. She assembled lists of Japanese trade barriers and began working through them systematically. Computing and telecommunications were high on her priority list. TRON's proposed adoption in Japanese schools made it an obvious target. Hills had the authority, the political backing, and the determination to act. In 1989, the United States formally raised TRON as a trade barrier in negotiations with Japan. The argument was straightforward: By mandating TRON in schools, Japan's Ministry of Education was creating a closed market that would give Japanese companies an unfair advantage and exclude American software. The US demanded that Japan abandon the plan to standardize on TRON and instead maintain an open procurement process that would allow American operating systems, meaning MS-DOS and eventually Windows, to compete on equal terms. The implicit threat was clear: if Japan didn't comply, TRON could be designated under Super 301, triggering potential tariffs and trade retaliation. Japan faced an impossible choice. On one hand, TRON represented a genuine technological achievement and a path to digital independence. Abandoning it would mean surrendering a strategic advantage and admitting that Japan's industrial policy could be vetoed by American pressure. On the other hand, Japan's entire economic model depended on access to American markets. The United States was Japan's largest export destination and most important ally. A trade war with America could devastate Japanese manufacturers. The semiconductor agreement had already shown that when push came to shove, Japan would bend. The question was how much pressure it would take this time. The negotiations were intense and largely hidden from public view. American trade officials pressed their case in meeting after meeting. Japanese bureaucrats tried to find compromises that would preserve TRON while satisfying American demands. But the American position was firm: no government mandate for TRON in schools. The Ministry of Education could recommend TRON if it wanted, but it couldn't require it, couldn't provide special funding for it, couldn't give it any official preference. Japanese manufacturers could keep developing TRON products, but they would have to compete in a market open to American alternatives. It was a diplomatic way of kneecapping the project. In 1989, Japan quietly backed down. The Ministry of Education abandoned its plan to standardize Japanese schools on TRON. There would be no massive government procurement of TRON-based computers, no educational ecosystem built around Sakamura's vision. The announcement was low-key, buried in bureaucratic language about maintaining open standards and fair competition. But everyone involved understood what had happened. American pressure had worked. Japan had sacrificed TRON to preserve trade relations. The decision was presented as a voluntary choice, a commitment to market openness. In reality, it was a capitulation to economic coercion. TRON's moment had passed. Ken Sakamura was philosophical in public but devastated in private. He had spent years building TRON, had rallied Japan's tech industry around it, had created something genuinely innovative. And it had been killed not by technical failure or market rejection, but by geopolitics. Sakamura continued working on TRON. The project didn't die completely. But without government backing, without the educational market, without the momentum of national support, TRON's potential to become a universal standard was gone. Sakamura would later reflect bitterly on the episode, seeing it as a turning point when Japan lost its chance to shape the digital future. Ironically, while BTRON failed to conquer personal computing, TRON quietly became one of the most successful operating systems in history. Because it was used in embedded systems, devices where the operating system is invisible to the user, it faced no trade barriers. Japanese manufacturers embedded TRON in cameras, printers, phones, cars, appliances, factory equipment. By the 2000s, TRON was running on billions of devices worldwide. It became the dominant platform for embedded systems in Japan and had significant market share globally. But it was a hidden success, unknown to consumers, generating no licensing revenue, creating no ecosystem. The grand vision had been reduced to invisible infrastructure. Into the vacuum left by TRON's retreat came Microsoft. Windows 3.0 launched in 1990 and became a global phenomenon. Windows 95 cemented Microsoft's dominance. By the late 1990s, Windows ran on over 90% of personal computers worldwide, including in Japan. Japanese manufacturers like NEC and Fujitsu, which had been developing BTRON computers, switched to making Windows machines. Japanese students learned computing on Windows. The digital literacy of an entire generation was shaped by Redmond, Washington, not Tokyo.
Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in history.
The alternate timeline where TRON became the global standard remained a tantalizing what-if. Japan's surrender on TRON had consequences that extended far beyond one operating system.
It established a precedent: when the United States applied enough pressure, Japan would abandon its industrial policy goals. It signaled that Japan's government could no longer effectively pick strategic industries and support them against foreign competition. The confidence of Japan's economic miracle years began to erode. The 1990s would bring the bursting of Japan's asset bubble, the lost decade of economic stagnation, and a long, slow retreat from the ambition to overtake the United States.
While many factors contributed to Japan's struggles, the TRON episode symbolized a larger loss of technological and economic initiative. From the American perspective, the TRON intervention was a success, one of many in a broader campaign to open Japanese markets and level the competitive playing field. American trade officials believed they were fighting against genuine unfair practices, against a system where government and industry colluded to exclude foreign competition. The fact that TRON was technically open source was, in their view, irrelevant. What mattered was government favoritism. And the American pressure worked. Japan's markets did open somewhat, American companies did gain access, the trade deficit did eventually moderate. Whether this justified the specific tactics remains debated. TRON was just one battle in a larger war. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States and Japan clashed over autos, agriculture, financial services, telecommunications, and more. The Structural Impediments Initiative forced Japan to change domestic policies like retail regulations and land use.
The framework talks of the Clinton years continued the pressure. Japan made concession after concession.
By the mid-1990s, the intensity of the conflict had diminished, partly because Japan's economy had weakened, partly because American attention shifted to other concerns, partly because both sides were exhausted. The trade war ended not with a peace treaty but with a whimper. It's impossible to know how history would have unfolded if Japan had stood firm on TRON.
Perhaps American retaliation would have been so severe that Japan's economy would have suffered even worse in the 1990s.
Perhaps TRON, even with government support, would have failed to compete with Windows on merit. Or perhaps, just perhaps, we would live in a different digital world today. A world where Japanese standards governed computing, where open-source principles dominated earlier, where the Internet of Things developed differently. Where Tokyo, not Silicon Valley, was the center of the software universe.
The counterfactual is tantalizing because TRON was genuinely innovative, technically sophisticated, and strategically conceived. One of TRON's most intriguing aspects was how prescient it was. Sakamura's insistence on open, royalty-free standards anticipated the open-source movement by a decade. Linux wouldn't emerge until 1991.
The open-source initiative wouldn't be founded until 1998. Yet in the mid-1980s, Sakamura was already articulating the principles that would later transform software development, that openness fosters innovation, that shared standards benefit everyone, that controlling the platform matters more than licensing fees. Had TRON succeeded, the open-source revolution might have started in Tokyo in the 1980s rather than globally in the 1990s. The software industry's evolution might have followed a very different path. While TRON failed in personal computing, its embedded systems variant left a genuine legacy. iTRON became a standard so pervasive that most people have used it without knowing. Your digital camera probably ran iTRON. Your car's engine control unit might have.
Countless industrial machines and consumer electronics. Japanese manufacturers continued to refine and develop iTRON for decades.
The TRON project itself evolved, spawning new variants like T-kernel and working on next-generation concepts. In 2017, TRON celebrated over 30 years of continuous development. It never became the universal operating system Sakamura envisioned, but it became something, a quiet, reliable, invisible foundation for the digital age. The TRON story offers lessons that resonate today. It demonstrates the limits of technological excellence when confronted with geopolitical power.
It shows how dependence on foreign markets can constrain domestic policy choices. It illustrates the strategic importance of software platforms and standards, something governments worldwide now understand acutely. China's efforts to develop domestic operating systems and reduce dependence on American software echo Japan's TRON ambitions. Europe's struggles to compete with American tech giants reflect similar dynamics.
The question of digital sovereignty, who controls the software infrastructure of society, remains as relevant now as it was in 1989, perhaps more so.
TRON wasn't the only Japanese technology initiative that ran into American opposition.
The Semiconductor Agreement of 1986 had already forced Japan to limit its dominance in memory chips. Japan's fifth-generation computer project, another ambitious MIDI-backed initiative to create artificial intelligence, was watched warily by the United States.
Again and again, when Japanese technology threatened American leadership, pressure followed. The pattern was consistent: initial Japanese success, American alarm, trade negotiations, Japanese retreat.
Some historians see this as naked protectionism, others as legitimate responses to unfair practices.
Either way, the pattern shaped the technology landscape we inherited. How much did Microsoft know about the TRON threat, and how actively did it lobby against it?
The historical record is fragmentary.
We know American tech companies raised concerns with trade officials. We know Microsoft was beginning to develop its international presence in the late 1980s and viewed Japan as a crucial market. We know the company had government relations staff who understood trade policy. But the specifics of Microsoft's role in the TRON intervention remain somewhat murky. What's clear is that Microsoft benefited enormously from TRON's failure. Windows conquered Japan without having to compete against a government-backed alternative.
Whether that victory was earned on merit or achieved through political leverage depends on your perspective.
The TRON conflict also reflected deeper cultural and economic differences.
Japan's model of close government-industry cooperation, long-term planning, and national champions clashed with American free market ideology, even though American technology leadership also benefited from massive government investment, just in different forms like defense contracts and university research grants.
Japan's consensus-driven decision-making struggled against American aggressive negotiating tactics. The language barrier and cultural misunderstandings complicated matters. Both sides believed they were acting legitimately within their own frameworks.
The collision of these different systems created friction that went far beyond any single technology or trade dispute.
Timing was crucial to TRON's fate.
Had it emerged 5 years earlier, before personal computers became a major market, it might have flown under the radar.
5 years later, after Japan's bubble had burst and its economy weakened, American pressure might have been less necessary. Market forces alone might have favored Windows.
But TRON hit at exactly the wrong moment, when personal computing was taking off, when Japan looked unstoppable, when American anxiety was peaking, when trade tensions were most intense. It became a symbol of broader concerns and was crushed by forces much larger than itself.
The technology almost didn't matter. The timing doomed it. The TRON episode was fundamentally about who would set standards for the digital age. Standards have network effects. The more people use them, the more valuable they become. The first standard to achieve critical mass often locks in, creating a winner-take-all dynamic. Sakamura understood this, which is why he made TRON open and free. He was trying to trigger that network effect before proprietary alternatives could dominate. Microsoft understood it too, which is why Windows was such a threat to TRON and vice versa. The battle wasn't really about which operating system was technically superior. It was about which standard would reach critical mass first and lock in a generation of users. Some economic historians draw a connection between the TRON failure and Japan's broader economic struggles in the 1990s.
The argument goes, Japan's industrial policy model, which had worked brilliantly for catch-up industrialization, started failing when Japan reached the technological frontier. TRON represented an attempt to lead in innovation, not just copy and improve on Western technology. When that attempt was thwarted, it contributed to a loss of confidence and direction.
Japan's tech industry became increasingly focused on domestic markets and incremental improvements rather than global standards setting. Whether TRON's success would have prevented the lost decade is debatable. But its failure certainly symbolized a turning point. Perhaps TRON's most remarkable aspect was how accurately it foresaw the Internet of Things. In the mid-1980s, when most computers were isolated machines, Sakamura envisioned a world of interconnected devices, exactly what emerged decades later. His architectural choices reflected this vision: lightweight operating systems for constrained devices, real-time capabilities, seamless communication protocols. Had TRON become the standard, the IoT might have developed differently, perhaps more standardized, perhaps more secure, perhaps with better interoperability. Instead, the modern IoT is a fragmented mess of competing standards, security vulnerabilities, and incompatible ecosystems. We got the interconnected world Sakamura predicted. We didn't get the elegant architecture he designed for it. Another dimension of TRON's story is the tension between academic idealism and commercial reality. Sakamura was a professor, not a businessman. His vision was driven by technical elegance and societal benefit, not profit maximization. The TRON Association was a consortium, not a corporation. This purity had advantages: it made TRON genuinely open and attracted broad support. But it also had weaknesses. There was no single powerful company with a huge financial stake in TRON's success, no marketing budget comparable to Microsoft's, no ruthless commercial drive. When political pressure came, there was no corporate giant to fight back with its own lobbying power. Academic idealism proved no match for commercial reality backed by state power. Ken Sakamura didn't give up after TRON's setback. He continued developing and refining the TRON family for decades. He worked on ubiquitous computing concepts, smart city infrastructure, and next-generation embedded systems. He founded the YRP Ubiquitous Networking Laboratory and continued to influence Japanese technology policy. In 2001, he was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame for his contributions to embedded systems. He received the THEO Award for his work on real-time operating systems. While he never achieved the global impact he sought with TRON, Sakamura remained a respected figure in computer science, a visionary who was ahead of his time, even if the timing worked against him. TRON's failure helped cement American dominance in software platforms. But it's worth asking, why did America win this battle so decisively? Part of it was market access leverage. Part was aggressive trade policy. But part was also a genuinely vibrant tech ecosystem. Silicon Valley in the 1980s and 90s had venture capital, entrepreneurial culture, flexible labor markets, world-class universities, and a tolerance for failure that fostered innovation. Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, Sun, Adobe, these companies emerged from a system that encouraged risk-taking and rewarded success. Japan had excellence in engineering and manufacturing but struggled to create a similar entrepreneurial ecosystem. TRON was impressive, but it emerged from a different system, one less adept at the chaotic innovation of software. Today, TRON's clearest legacy lives on in embedded systems. Itron, microitron, and its successor T-kernel remain important platforms for real-time embedded applications. Japanese manufacturers still prefer TRON variants for many applications. The TRON project continues as a research and standards body. In 2018, TRON was rebranded and reorganized but continues to evolve. The vision of a universal operating system never materialized, but the practical impact on embedded systems was real and lasting. Billions of devices have run TRON code. Countless engineers have worked with it. In this narrower domain, Sakamura's vision succeeded. It just wasn't the world-changing success he'd hoped for. The TRON story eerily foreshadows modern tech conflicts. The United States' efforts to limit Huawei's 5G equipment echo the concerns about TRON creating a closed ecosystem. China's development of domestic operating systems like Kylin and Harmony OS reflects Japan's TRON ambitions. Europe's antitrust actions against American tech giants parallel Japan's attempts to protect its markets. the global semiconductor competition revisits 1980s dynamics.
The underlying tensions between free markets and industrial policy, between openness and sovereignty, between technological leadership and geopolitical power remain unresolved. Every generation fights these battles again with new technologies. TRON's story is not ancient history. It's a template for understanding conflicts happening right now. Did American pressure on TRON serve American interests? In the short term, undoubtedly yes. Microsoft and other American software companies gained unimpeded access to Japanese markets. American technological leadership in software was preserved. The precedent discouraged other countries from backing national operating system projects. But in the longer term, the calculus is more complex. The aggressive tactics contributed to anti-American sentiment in Japan. They may have stifled innovation by making Japan's tech industry more cautious. And they established patterns that other countries noticed. China, watching what happened to Japan, learned to be less dependent on American approval and more focused on technological self-sufficiency. America could have unfolded differently. TRON represents a road not taken. One of TRON's painful lessons is that technical excellence alone doesn't determine success in the technology industry. By many accounts, TRON was well-designed, thoughtfully architected, and technically sophisticated. Sakamura and his team had done impressive work. But technology success depends on many factors beyond technical merit: timing, marketing, ecosystem building, business models, and, crucially, political and economic context. TRON had the misfortune of being excellent technology in impossible circumstances. Its failure wasn't because it was poorly designed. It failed because forces beyond technology intervened. For engineers and technologists who believe the best technology should win, TRON's story is a sobering reminder that the world doesn't work that way. The modern open-source movement owes an unacknowledged debt to TRON. Sakamura articulated and demonstrated principles that would become central to open source years later: that openness fosters innovation, that royalty-free standards benefit everyone, that controlling the ecosystem matters more than licensing fees. He showed that open development could produce high-quality software. He built a working model of collaborative, non-proprietary technology development. When Linus Torvalds released Linux in 1991, when the Open Source Initiative formed in 1998, they were reinventing ideas Sakamura had already implemented. TRON proved the concept before the movement had a name. That contribution deserves recognition, even if TRON itself didn't achieve its goals. TRON became entangled with Japanese national pride, which made its failure more painful. It represented Japan's ambitions to lead, not follow, in technology. It was supposed to demonstrate that Japan could innovate, not just manufacture. When American pressure forced Japan to back down, it wasn't just a technology setback, it was a blow to national prestige. The Japanese press covered the episode with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Politicians who had championed TRON quietly distanced themselves. The broader public, which had been led to expect Japan's inevitable technological supremacy, experienced confusion and disappointment. The gap between national ambitions and economic reality, the need to maintain access to American markets, created a cognitive dissonance that Japan struggled to resolve. It's interesting to contrast how Japan dealt with Microsoft versus IBM. In earlier decades, Japan had successfully challenged IBM's dominance in computing. Japanese companies like Fujitsu and Hitachi developed their own mainframe computers, sometimes through questionable means like industrial espionage, but they competed effectively. Japan limited IBM's market share and built a domestic computer industry. But when Microsoft emerged in the 1980s and 90s, the dynamics were different. Software was harder to reverse engineer than hardware. Network effects were stronger. And crucially, American trade policy had become more aggressive. Japan couldn't replicate its IBM strategy against Microsoft. The world had changed, and Japan's playbook didn't work anymore. The rise of the Internet of Things has sparked renewed interest in TRON. As billions of connected devices create demand for lightweight, real-time operating systems, TRON's original vision looks remarkably prescient. Some embedded systems developers have revisited TRON and its descendants as alternatives to Linux-based systems for IoT applications. The TRON forum has positioned T-kernel and other TRON variants as solutions for modern IoT challenges. But the IoT market is now crowded with alternatives: embedded Linux, FreeRTOS, Zephyr, Android Things, proprietary systems from major vendors. TRON must compete in a fragmented landscape it once hoped to unify. The vision that was too early in 1989 is now one of many options, not the universal standard. Developing nations looking to build technological sovereignty study the TRON episode closely. It demonstrates both the potential and the limits of government-backed technology initiatives. On one hand, Japan showed that a coordinated national effort can create world-class technology. On the other hand, TRON's failure illustrates the challenges of defying American economic pressure when your economy depends on American markets. Countries like India, Brazil, and various African nations developing domestic technology ecosystems face similar dilemmas. How do you build technological independence while remaining integrated with the global economy? How do you protect nascent domestic industries without triggering trade retaliation? TRON offers no easy answers, but it provides a case study of the challenges involved. What's remarkable about Ken Sakamura is that he never abandoned his vision. Decades after TRON's political defeat, he continues working on ubiquitous computing, open standards, and interconnected systems. His recent work on smart cities, digital twins, and IoT infrastructure carries forward the principles he articulated in the 1980s. He's now in his 70s but remains active, teaching, researching, and promoting his vision of how technology should serve society. TRON didn't win, but Sakamura didn't quit. His persistence represents a kind of victory not in the marketplace, but in the realm of ideas. Some visions are too important to abandon, even when the world doesn't immediately embrace them. In academic computer science, TRON occupies an interesting niche. It's studied as an example of real-time operating system design, referenced in embedded systems courses, and examined in courses on technology policy and standards wars. Computer science historians recognize TRON's technical contributions even while acknowledging its commercial failure. Some universities still teach TRON architecture as an example of elegant system design. In Japan, TRON remains a point of pride in computer science departments, a homegrown technology that achieved genuine technical excellence even if it didn't conquer the world. For students of computer history, TRON is a reminder that the technologies that win commercially are not always the technologies that deserve to win technically. TRON's story reveals technology as a geopolitical battleground where economic power, national sovereignty, and technological standards collide. It's not simply about which product is better or which company is more innovative. It's about which country controls the infrastructure of the digital age, who sets the rules, whose standards govern global commerce and communication. These battles continue with AI, quantum computing, 5G, semiconductor manufacturing, and other frontier technologies. Nations invest billions to achieve leadership or self-sufficiency. Trade negotiations involve technology transfers and market access. What happened to TRON in 1989 happens in different forms every year. Technology policy has become inseparable from foreign policy. The TRON episode was an early example of dynamics that now define international relations. Despite TRON's setback, Ken Sakamura remained influential in Japanese technology circles. He advised government ministries on technology policy, participated in standards bodies, mentored generations of students, and contributed to various national technology initiatives. His ideas about open standards and ubiquitous computing influenced Japan's approach to technology development even when TRON itself wasn't adopted. In some sense, Sakamura won the argument even if he lost the battle. His vision of interconnected devices became reality, and Japan's tech industry absorbed many of his principles about the importance of standards and interoperability. The man outlasted the setback, and his influence extended far beyond the specific fate of TRON.
Today's technology landscape is fragmented in ways that would have disappointed Sakamura.
We have dozens of operating systems: Windows, Mac OS, Linux distributions, Android, iOS, embedded systems running various kernels. The Internet of Things is a chaos of incompatible protocols and competing standards.
Your smart home devices often can't talk to each other. Data doesn't flow seamlessly between systems. Interoperability remains an aspiration more than a reality. This fragmentation creates inefficiency, security vulnerabilities, and user frustration.
It's precisely what TRON was designed to prevent.
Whether a TRON-dominated world would actually have been better is unknowable.
But it's hard to look at today's technological landscape and not wonder if we lost something when the vision of a universal, open, interoperable platform was defeated.
Most people have never heard of TRON. In the West, it's almost completely forgotten if it was ever known.
Even in Japan, younger generations are largely unaware of the project. The operating system that promised to run the world became a footnote, remembered mainly by specialists and historians.
This forgetting is itself significant. Technology history tends to be written by the winners. Microsoft's dominance looks inevitable in retrospect, as if Windows was always destined to conquer because it was the best solution. TRON's existence challenges that narrative.
It reminds us that history is contingent, that different choices would have led to different outcomes, that the technological present we inhabit is just one possibility among many.
Remembering TRON means remembering that things could have been different. Was American pressure on TRON fair? It depends on your framework.
From a pure free market perspective, government backing of TRON was market distortion that justified intervention. From a realist geopolitics perspective, America was protecting its strategic interests, as any nation would. From Japan's perspective, it was bullying by a stronger power. From a technology perspective, it was tragic that politics killed a promising innovation.
There's no objective answer.
Different values and frameworks lead to different conclusions. What's clear is that the episode reveals the messy reality of how technology development actually works, not in a neutral marketplace of ideas where the best solution wins, but in a complex web of national interests, corporate power, trade negotiations, and geopolitical leverage.
TRON's story raises questions that remain relevant decades later. Should governments support strategic technologies or let markets decide? Can small or medium powers maintain technological independence in a globalized economy? Do open standards and proprietary systems compete on equal terms, or do open standards need government support to overcome network effects? How much should trade policy be used to advance corporate interests? Is technological sovereignty worth economic costs? These aren't abstract questions.
Countries confront them constantly as they navigate technology policy in an interconnected but competitive world. TRON doesn't answer these questions, but it illustrates what's at stake when they're decided. The episode remains a valuable case study for anyone thinking about technology, economics, and power. Imagine the alternative timeline where TRON succeeded. Japanese schools standardized on it in the early 1990s.
Students learned programming in a TRON environment. Japanese manufacturers embedded it in everything. The network effects kicked in, and global adoption followed. Microsoft became a minor player, Windows a regional alternative.
Open source principles dominated software from the 1990s onward.
Tokyo rivaled Silicon Valley as a technology hub. Software development culture incorporated Japanese approaches to quality and long-term thinking.
The Internet of Things developed around unified TRON standards, creating seamless interoperability.
It's an intriguing vision, not necessarily better, but different.
This alternative timeline exists only in imagination, but contemplating it reveals how contingent our technological present really is. TRON was a dream that almost became reality, a vision of universal, open, interoperable computing that could have shaped the digital age. Ken Sakamura and his team created something genuinely innovative, technically sophisticated, and strategically important. For a brief moment, it looked like Japan might actually pull it off, might establish a new global standard, might define how the future would work.
But geopolitics intervened.
American pressure, Japanese dependence on American markets, and the brutal realities of trade negotiations killed the dream. TRON survived in embedded systems, influencing billions of devices invisibly. But the grand vision, one operating system for everything, remained unrealized. It's a story of technological ambition confronting political reality, of innovation crushed by power, of roads not taken. And it's a reminder that the technological world we inhabit is not inevitable, but the result of countless decisions, pressures, and power dynamics.
TRON represents what might have been and what we lost when it wasn't allowed to be.